Today's gospel story, the story of doubting Thomas, always reminds me of another story. This was shared with me by my late grandfather, whose name was also Thomas. Now, my grandfather Thomas worked for the local timber company. He was a heavy equipment operator and a truck driver. And one day he was delivering a truck load of pine logs from the site to the lumber mill back in town. Now, the road that he was driving wasn't paved. It was a wide dirt road, large enough for two of these trucks to pass each other and made up of sand and gravel. And my grandfather, daredevil that he was driving much too fast down this dirt road. So there he was. And in the rearview mirror, he sees, and his heart drops, because the back of this truck is beginning to fishtail out from behind him. And so, what does he do? He lets off the gas, and he turns the wheel hard to face the direction, and he brings the back of the truck back into alignment. And then he turns the wheel hard back the other direction, and he brings the truck back into alignment. And he does this, and he does this, until finally, while the truck is still moving, everything is back in place. And he makes the delivery on time and gets home early for dinner. Now, I have always been and will always remain doubtful of this story. And I would say that that is a good and proper response because, as it turns out, doubt is not always a bad thing. At least not when your grandfather is telling you yet another unbelievable big fish story. Doubt is one of the ways that we as humans distinguish between what is false and what is true. When we hear a story that just doesn't add up, when we receive information that seems contrary to the facts, when we cannot buy into the belief of another person or another party, we are doubting. And again, that's not always a bad thing. Most of the time, doubt is a natural human response. If my husband says to me, "Don't worry, honey, it's not going to rain today," but I go outside and I see storm clouds on the horizon and hear rumbling thunder, I would doubt him. If Will texted me tomorrow and said, "Don't worry, Justin, the bishop just sent me an email that says you don't actually have to take your final exams," I would doubt him. And if all of my friends tracked me down and told me that they had seen our beloved teacher again in the flesh after we had all just watched him die with our own eyes, I would doubt them. And I know that I would doubt them. And I suspect that many others would. And so I believe that Thomas gets a bit of a sour deal in today's gospel. It's a little too easy to make Thomas into a scapegoat, the woefully literal, tragically stubborn Thomas, who could not suspend his disbelief in the possibility of resurrection long enough to accept that the Lord was risen indeed. Despite all the portents and prophecies that Thomas had heard Jesus speak, despite all the wonders and signs that Thomas had seen Jesus perform, despite all the faith in Jesus that Thomas had had up until this moment at this critical juncture, Thomas cannot believe. The facts are simply contrary to the information. The story doesn't add up. Thomas doubts, and 2,000 years of Christian tradition seal his reputation as doubting Thomas. But doubt is not always a bad thing. Doubt is how we distinguish between what is false and what is true, and sometimes, even when we doubt a thing that ultimately turns out to be true, the effort and the relief of realizing that truth through our doubt can lead us to even greater heights of belief. So let's look at the gospel again. The disciples are huddled together in a locked room on the evening of the first Easter, and they are terrified that the Jewish authorities are coming for them the same way they came for Jesus. Now, by now they all know that Jesus' body is no longer lying in the tomb, but they don't yet understand because, as John says earlier in the gospel, they did not understand that the scripture said that Jesus must rise from the dead. So it's into this atmosphere of panic and confusion that Jesus suddenly appears and says, "Peace be with you." And then, as if to prove that it really is him, he shows them his hands and his side. Upon seeing the wounds, the disciples rejoice to behold their Lord alive again, risen and in the flesh. They rejoice, and their despair is lifted. But Thomas wasn't there. Maybe Thomas was guarding the door. Maybe Thomas needed some time alone to process his grief. For whatever reason, Thomas wasn't there. And so he didn't see Jesus. And when all of his friends tell him later that they saw Jesus, it is perhaps with a tinge of desperation and despair in his voice that Thomas escalates the situation. It will not be enough for Thomas just to see Jesus. Unless he can touch the wounds on his body, Thomas will never believe. And then, in perhaps what is the ultimate case of be careful what you ask for, Thomas gets his wish. Jesus appears to the disciples again a week later and, speaking directly to Thomas, invites him to touch the wounds in his hands and his side. Now, the gospel doesn't actually say whether or not Thomas did touch the wounds, but it does record what Thomas says. Jesus says to Thomas, "Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas replies, "My Lord and my God." And this is astonishing. It is astonishing because with this confession, doubting Thomas becomes the very first disciple to say explicitly that Jesus Christ is in fact God. Now, almost all of the disciples affirm at one point or another that Jesus is sent by God or is close to God in some way. And Peter, whose preaching we just heard today and who I would just like to remind everyone in the room also doubted Jesus at many times. Peter says that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. In his own teachings and parables, Jesus often places himself very close to the Father, so much so that the Jewish authorities accuse him of equating himself with God. But of all the disciples gathered in that room on that first week after Easter, only Thomas the doubter says, "My Lord and my God." And this confession changes the entire course of the conversation about who Jesus is. It illuminates the radical new consideration that Jesus was not simply sent by God, but was God and is God in the flesh. Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us. Of all the disciples gathered in that room, only doubting Thomas apprehends and vocalizes the deeper truth that lies behind the truth of the resurrection, that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, who was attested to them and to us, is not only of God, but is God. And with that, Thomas's confession closes the Gospel of John on the same note with which it opened. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and this Word became flesh and dwelt among us in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. In time, this confession became the bedrock of our own confession about who Jesus is, as we will say shortly, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. Every Sunday, we affirm our faith in the belief that Jesus is God incarnate, And we do so in the wake of the confession of a one who is, was, and will forever be known as doubting. And that isn't a bad thing. It might even be a good thing. Because if one doubter in a room full of witnesses can make such a profound statement of belief after seeing and experiencing God, then there is hope for doubters everywhere. There is hope that doubt and belief are not as opposed as we might think, and that by journeying through our doubt, we can arrive at even greater heights of belief. Because you see, I doubt that doubt is the true enemy of belief. When Jesus first appears to the disciples, he doesn't show up in the middle of a theological debate on the truth of the resurrection, ready to settle the score once and for all. When he shows up to them the first time, he shows up in the midst of their confusion and their despair, when they are grieving the present and dreading the future. Jesus says, "Peace be with you." And when they realize that it's him, their despair melts away and joy takes its place. And this leads me to believe that not doubt, but despair is the true enemy of faith. It was despair and not doubt that kept the disciples locked away in that room, hidden from the world. And it was despair at Jesus' death that fed Thomas's inability to believe. And it was his joy at finally seeing the risen Lord that resurrected his belief and carried it above and beyond. So would Thomas have been able to say, "My Lord and my God," if he had never doubted in the first place? Well, we'll never know for sure, but personally, I doubt it. I doubt it because I also doubt that Jesus did not realize that Thomas was not present with the other disciples. Think about it. The risen Jesus, God incarnate, must have known that Thomas was not there. And knowing that, he must also have known that Thomas, being human like anyone else, would have his doubts. Yet rather than appearing in a way that would erase all doubts of the truth of the resurrection, Jesus allowed doubt to appear in Thomas, not because he was powerless to stop it, but because he was proving a point. After all, these things were written so that we who have not seen Jesus might still come to believe in him and love him. And so this is what I have come to believe. Doubts will come, and doubts will go. But this is not a bad thing. What truly kills faith is not doubt, but despair. And if we allow despair to take root, then the grave will surely swallow our faith. But if we persevere through despair and wrestle with our doubt and help each other along the way, then our faith will rise again, stronger, brighter, like gold refined by fire. In this, our best hope is to keep the Lord close at hand, to seek the joy of the resurrection, and to show forth that joy in our lives, trusting that the spirit of peace and reconciliation will come to us and to everyone in time to melt away despair. Now, the story of doubting Thomas always reminds me of another story. It reminds me of a cold Easter morning 13 years ago when I first felt the joy of the resurrection warm my heart. I had despaired that because of my love, God would never love me. I was afraid that if all this really was true, I was surely bound for hell. And so I doubted everything, because how could something so horrible be true? I doubted for years until my despair nearly swallowed me. And in my desperation, I went looking for that peace which the world cannot give. And honestly, I doubted that I would find it. But against all odds, I did find peace on that Easter morning, peace and faith and hope and joy, that death has been defeated and that the Lord is risen indeed. And now, 13 years later, I am standing here with all of you. And would I be here if I had never doubted? Well, we'll never know for sure. But even so, I believe that my faith is stronger today because it first grew from doubt. And that it is because of faith, tested and refined by doubt, that I, and other doubters like me, can say with Thomas, "My Lord and my God." Amen.